Jeff was born in Manhattan, grew up in Flushing, Queens. His schooling was all in New York, attended Lemoyne College, which was a Jesuit school, and Columbia University, which is not a Jesuit school. Went to Fordham University Law School. Was an associate at Townley Updike Carter and Rogers, a boutique Wall Street law firm. Came to Kalamazoo with his wife Brenda in October of 1973, and at one time spent 17 years as the counsel for Upjohn Agricultural Division. His boss, Jerry Thomas, said Jeff and his farmer's overalls tailored, had his farmer's overalls tailored at Brooks Brothers, so apparently a very well-dressed farmer. Since he retired, he spent the last 18 years mediating divorce cases and playing golf and swimming. So I give you Jeff Murphy and the Flushing Remonstrance.
Well, thank you all very much. By the way, that's something you'll see later on. We talk. That's the house that John Bound built in 1662. It's sort of indirectly related. Okay, and it's still there today. So, what am I talking about tonight, and how did I get started and involved in such an obscure topic? Not complicated, just an accidental combination of events. My granddaughter Margot was going into her senior year at Grosse Pointe South and was attending a New York Times seminar for aspiring high school photojournalists. The seminar included a tour of the 5 boroughs of the city. This critical stop on her tour for us tonight was in Queens at the historic Bound House in Flushing. I wish I had known in advance, since I grew up near the site, and I would have liked her to visit my hometown, my area, my places, okay? I happened to mention her trip to my friend Susan B. Anthony. You remember hearing Susan's presentation about the trials and tribulations of being an international opera star. Well, Susan, being Susan, she immediately mocked me for being from a town with such a crappy name as Flushing. Actually, don't tell her, but I never liked the name either. It just doesn't take imagination to figure out what that name makes you think of. So anyway, I decided to look up the Bound House on Google. Lo and behold, up came the early history of the New Netherlands and Henry Hudson and the founding of a town called Vlissingen in 1645 by a group of English colonists. But the articles went on to talk about a document called the Flushing Remonstrance and its importance in the history of the fight for universal religious freedom. And I discovered the thing had been written near my childhood home 367 years ago. And I never heard of it. History was my favorite subject. It was never mentioned in my grade school, nor had its existence been publicized as a source of tourism or just fame for Flushing. In plain English, nobody living in Flushing knew anything about it either. As I said, the articles I came across mentioned how important the document was as a basis for the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights that was written 130 years later. And the accounts went on and on about an English colonial named John Bound and his family and their descendants and their rather unique contributions to New York and the country over the next 250 years. So I became obsessed with the history surrounding the Remonstrance and all the people who were involved directly or indirectly with it, and also with the descendants of John Bound himself. What was bizarre were the number of people and organizations that seemed to have an accidental influence on the creation of the Remonstrance. Let's see if I've got it in here. Am I working this thing right? Is this right here? No. What am I doing?
It'd be helpful if I turn it on. That would be helpful, right? There we go. That button right
All
there.
right. That's happened before. Okay, let's try that. So what got us here? Well, obviously, colonialism, Dutch and the British East India Companies, Henry Hudson, he's a very key figure. Then the Dutch West Indies, Peter Minuet, William Key, if you don't know him, the English colonists who ended up writing it, George Fox and the Quakers. Without them, we wouldn't have had anything. And then you had to have the Dutch hatred of the Quakers and Peter Stuyvesant, the way he acted. And this shipload of Quakers came in just in perfect timing for what we're dealing with, especially the guys who escaped. And this Hodgson was really a key figure. We'll get to him. And then we have Stuyvesant's cool treatment of him as really the instigator. Pass on that. So, what is a remonstrance anyway? I'll bet 1,000 out of 1,000 people surveyed never heard of the word remonstrance in the first place. But you ask some practicing Catholics, and they would say it's this, except it's missing a couple of letters. This is a monstrance. Okay, close but no cigar. If you're not a Catholic, it's called a monstrance that holds the Holy Eucharist and is put on display during special devotional ceremonies. But it's definitely not a symbol of religious freedom. So, what is the definition? Webster's calls it a forcefully reproachful protest or an honest presentation of reasons for opposition or grievance. So, what's special about the Flushing remonstrance? Who else ever used the word remonstrance? I found only one proposal with a specific name like the Flushing remonstrance and the intent of being read as quote unquote a forceful petition. It's called the Grand Remonstrance, and it was written by members of the English House of Commons 16 years earlier in 1641, and it listed 17 grievances against King Charles. But it was not seeking religious freedom. In fact, it wanted Charles to stop working with the Catholic Church, and it was mainly about his usurpation of Parliament's duties and authority. It led to the Civil War, the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, and the King's beheading. Okay, so now, as you may know, it was accepted about everywhere at the time that religion was a key affair of the state. In England, in Europe, you can start with the severe restrictions of the Catholic Church itself, and you could actually include Martin Luther, who initially was tolerant of religious diversity until the Reformation took hold and even he became restrictive. So, what were some of the attempts to promote religious freedom in the colonies before our remonstrance? Well, it happened in different ways in different colonies, if it happened at all. Colonies like Massachusetts, Connecticut protected their Puritans, and that caused Roger Williams to create Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Charter that guaranteed a full liberty in religious concernments and blah, blah, blah. But that was in the 1630s. But there was another contemporary document that was written about the same time as the Remonstrance. The Toleration Act of 1649 made persecution against any Christian sect a crime in Maryland. Virginia, on the other hand, was one of the strongest opponents of freedom right up to the Revolution. According to one writer, even on the eve of the Revolution, it seemed as if the Church of England was about to become the official religion of all the colonies. But it had already gained that status south of the Mason-Dixon line. As I said, the Flushing Remonstrance expressed a concept far beyond the principles of any contemporary document. The most any of the other documents demanded was freedom for members of existing Christian sects. In short, there was no consistent trend or tendency towards disestablishment and universal religious freedom. Now, in the middle of this diversity of opinion, what do we do to turn this thing off? I know we wanted to go blank. Was that on the left? Bottom right? Here we go. Thank you, sir. Let's see where we're at. So now comes some 30 Englishmen who acted as a group, a protest committee of regular colonists, not elite rulers. And they were willing to endorse a vision that went far beyond what any elite thinker, including Roger Williams or William Penn, dared support. And their protest was written not by a single leader like Williams or Penn, but by a group who collectively let out a shout unlike any of the others. And they did it in a very dramatic and ultimately painful way. The purpose of that petition was not intended as a plea for religious freedom and tolerance for themselves. It was a demand for universal religious freedom, and especially tolerance for an obnoxious group of rabble-rousers who were trying to settle near the English colonists and establish a new religion and preach their heresy and hold meetings in local homes. Oh, by the way, when the First Amendment was adopted in 1791, inspired by the Flushing Remonstrance, 8 of the 13 colonies had state religions. You may not know this, but one of the main purposes of the First Amendment was to prevent the new federal government from establishing its own state religion in competition with the state religions of the former colonies. So, what was the language used that set the Remonstrance apart from the others? Well, guess what? I gave you the full petition, okay? And I'm not going to put you to sleep reading all of the parts of it. So I'm just going to cherry pick some of the language. And it starts out with, let me see what we got. You told us, dear Stuyvesant, you told us we should not receive or entertain any of these people called Quakers because they are supposed to be seducers of the people. So basically, Stein told people not to have any contact with them. Then it says, and it's all these quotations are from the Bible, that we cannot condemn them, okay? Because out of God comes a consuming fire. And it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. And we desire not to judge, lest we be judged, either condemned, lest we be condemned, but rather let every man stand or fall to his own master. And it says, very simply, if God justifies, then who can condemn? And if God condemns, there is none to justify. And let's see if I have this. Whoops. And here we go. Yeah. The colonists called for universal religious freedom. And basically, it says the law of love, etc., extends to Jews, Turks, and Egyptians, as they are considered sons of God. This was not to be found in any of the other petitions of the time. Okay? And we desire not to offend these little ones, but be glad to see anything of God in any of them. And then finally, they say they strive, if any of these people come in love unto us, we're going to give them free egress and regress into our town and our houses. And we're bound by the law of God to do good unto all men. So they were stretching it out for everybody, including the rabble rousers. There are 15 direct references to passages in the Bible as rationale and justification for their arguments. The petition did not cite natural law, which was popular in the High Middle Ages, or English common law, which you would expect, or even Enlightenment arguments. In short, it says, we are right because God says so. That's their reasoning. And he will punish us, Stuyvesant, if we obey you. So that's some of the key language. As I said before, unlike other declarations, it was written to support a group of outsiders. So what caused the group to write and send the petition? Well, it was a reaction to Peter Stuyvesant's anti-Quake edict that he ordered, plus his brutal behavior in the name of the church against one of the Quaker preachers by the name of Robert Hodgson, or Vlissingen, Flushing Wasp, got together in the next month to write their protest. And on December 27th, Edward Hart, who was actually the sheriff of Flushing, wrote the Remonstrance. It was signed by him and 29 other WASP Flushingites, none of whom were Quakers. So we find the Remonstrance is kind of obscure, but historians think of this. See if I get this one up here now, if I can do something right. Okay. The historians considered it a precursor to the Bill of Rights because it articulated a fundamental right, universal religious freedom that we consider basic. Two, they had the guts, the courageous and dangerous action of sending it to a guy who was basically evil and feared, okay, for his religious intolerance. And third, it's considered important because it was not about them. They stood up for religious freedom for a radical fringe religious sect known as rabble rousers. So this last item was remarkable because it protected a new religion, unlike the other documents which protected only existing ones. Oh, by the way, some historians say Sheriff Edward Hart did not create the strong language in the document. He wrote the document because he had the best handwriting. In the meantime, not all the WASPs in Flushing supported the arguments of the Remonstrance. Many were willing to turn in those who continued to let Quakers in their homes to preach. And we're going to see that our new friend John Bound. As again, as mentioned, it was written December 27, 1657, to protest against the actions of Peter Stuyvesant. So what was the response to this very powerful petition? The petition got Stuy's attention, and his response was to have the drafter, Edward Hart, and several other signers arrested, brought to New Amsterdam, and he was put in a dungeon and fed bread and water. And the remonstrance naturally did not lead to the repeal of the law. So the anti-Quaker law remained in place. So who were the players in this thing? Now you have to give me breathing room for a second. Throw all this stuff out. There we go. There it is. So interesting, at least to me, is that even if one of the otherwise unrelated events that I listed earlier had not taken place, there would never have been a Flushing Remonstrance. So first up are the Dutch East and West India companies and a guy named Henry Hudson. So most of you know from high school history class that the East India Company was chartered by the Dutch in the early 1600s to exploit the wealth in Asia. Some say it was the first multinational company. It traded slaves, tobacco, sugar, spices, tea. It founded colonies. It waged war, and it could imprison and execute convicts, and it can enter into treaties. And as you may know, it's a long way from Holland and England to India, with that damn new world continent in the way. So, in an attempt to find a shorter way to get there, the East India Company hired an English explorer named Henry Hudson to search for the Northwest Passage. So there were 3 separate exploration attempts by Hudson to find that passage. The first 2 were for his home country, England, and its East India Company. When he failed to find the passage after 2 tries, they fired him. So then in 1609, he was hired by the Dutch to give it another try. This time, he went a little farther south, and he stumbled upon a north-south river on the east coast of America that he thought might be helpful. So he went up about 125 miles and turned back once he saw it wasn't going to work. Oh, by the way, the place where he turned around was near where we had a country house, and it's now called Hudson, New York, 125 miles from the harbor, and it was a whaling town, 125 miles north. It was amazing, okay? But not to waste the trip, he planted the flag and claimed all the surrounding territory for the Dutch. Now, if he had explored for his home country instead of the Dutch and claimed the territory for England, there would never have been a remonstrance to protest a Dutch law. There would never have been a New Netherlands. So now to the Dutch West Indies Company. So they waited a few years before they realized that they could set up very profitable trading posts on that river, and they formed the Dutch West Indies, West India Company in 1621. It had all the same powers as the East India Company, and in 1625 they started a trading post in what became New Amsterdam. So as of next year, New Amsterdam, New York would be 400 years old. The Dutch were initially not interested in permanent settlements and colonizations like the English were doing up and down the East Coast. They just wanted to make a bunch of money to keep their golden age going and finance against the Spanish. So during the existence of the colony, had 4 director generals. Whoops, that's just. Aside from our man Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last, the most famous was Peter Minuet, who allegedly purchased Mannahatta Island from the local tribe for $24 worth of wampum. At least that's what we kids were told in grade school. I heard they actually paid him Dutch guilders. I don't know what bank they can take it to, but whatever. So over the next 20 years, the West Indies Company worked hard to get some Dutch to colonize the new town. But it was actually a boatload of Walloons, not Dutch, who came first. The Dutch who came to trade beaver pelts went back home to get away from the uncivilized wilderness. There was no Amsterdam, Holland. So then some English colonists, immigrants started arriving, and one group obtained a town charter from Stuyvesant's predecessor, William Kieft, in 1645. And without those wasps, there would never have been a remonstrance, since the local Dutch colonists and others were not protesting Stuyvesant's anti-Quaker actions. The town was located in the northeast section of Queens. It's in the maps that my wife created for you, and I will show you where it is. And it was given that name, Vlissingen. Suddenly, the eventual name Flushing doesn't sound so bad. So, as a quick aside, many of us have an image of poor immigrants settling in mud huts and becoming poor dirt farmers. Not quite. John Bound's wife, Hannah Feek, was a niece of both the governor of Massachusetts and the governor of Connecticut. They weren't starving. So now we have the Indies companies and an English explorer who claims a piece of choice real estate for his country's chief rival, okay? And some WASPs who settle in what we New Yorkers call bridge and tunnel country. And add to that a man who was fiercely devout member of the Dutch Reformed Church, Peter Stuyvesant. Okay, Murphy, let's see you do this again. There it is. And, without him and his extremely cool ways, we wouldn't have had a remonstrance. He was a key figure. So what's his story? As to his background, he was just middle class, which was unusual since most leadership positions were held by the upper classes and wealthy merchant classes. But he proved his worth when he joined the West Indies Company in 1633 and was effective in Brazil and Curacao. But he did manage to get a souvenir for his work there. A Spanish cannonball crushed his right leg, and he ended up with a wooden leg, hence he's got the name Peg Leg Pete. So, in 1647, he was posted to New Netherlands as Director General to clean up the mess his two prior directors had created. It seems the colony's buildings were in disrepair, the roads were a disaster. And this is funny. He tried to stop the pigs that the locals let wander in the streets. Unfortunately, he and then his English successors and then their American successors failed to fix that problem. I've read of complaints of pigs in the streets of New York 200 years later in the 1830s. Didn't happen. So he was best known as their last Director General and his most influential. He's praised for making New Amsterdam orderly and economically successful, and he helped that success by being a major player in getting the colony heavily invested in the African slave trade. At one point, those enslaved persons made up 20% of New Amsterdam's population. But back to them in a little while. Next in our list of players is that obnoxious, rabble-rousing group of heretics we call Friends or Quakers. I'm sure most of you, myself included, always think of them as a quiet, pacifist group on the sidelines of our religious environment culture. But back in the 1600s, when George Fox founded the sect, they were considered rabble-rousing, lunatic, evil heretics. While their stated goal was to revive primitive Christianity, emphasizing non-violence, simple living, and God's concern for the marginalized and immediate and equal access to God's Spirit, they managed to refuse to pay tithes to the Church of England. They refused to take oaths. They rejected all priestly authority. They gathered in expectant silence, waiting for the Spirit to rise in one of them. This posture was contrary to the religious practices at the time in the minds of European religious leaders. But this is what made them more interesting. A major problem for them was that their religious services did not go over well. In addition to the above actions, they would loudly disrupt church services, engaging in ecstatic blasphemy, believe it or not, joyous tobacco smoking. Oh, yes, they ran naked in the streets. Okay? Didn't go over well with the establishment. That's why, as I mentioned, at the time of our remonstrance, they were called belligerent and boisterous rabble-rousers. Well, anyway, so they came here. The first group arrived in New Amsterdam in August 5th, 1657. The ship had no flag of origin flying, nor did it fire a signal announcing its arrival, which was the custom. So this was unusual enough for Stuyvesant himself to go on board and see what was going on. He was shown none of the respect normally demanded for someone in his position. And the master of the ship didn't even remove his hat, which seems to be a big deal in every one of these things. He kept quiet with good reason. Among the ship's cargo were 11 so-called friends, the Quakers. They were on their way to New England to escape from the hatred they had experienced in Europe. So it's not surprising that Stuyvesant told them to hit the road. And so the ship sailed away the next morning, but naturally and secretly, the 11 believers stayed behind. Okay? As the ship was slowly leaving the harbor, 2 women who remained behind began quaking and went into a frenzy. And they wailed in the middle of the street, crying that the people should repent, for the day of judgment was at hand. Okay? Panicked, the townspeople thought it was a fire, and pandemonium broke out. So they got arrested and thrown into the dungeon. When their fellow travelers saw what happened, 3 of them immediately left Manhattan and went to Long Island. One of the 3 was a 23-year-old named Robert Hodgson, a recent and vocal convert. But he didn't go all the way to the Hamptons like we should have. He went to southern Queens, to what is now called Jamaica. He preached there, and then he went up to Flushing and was treated with polite courtesy. But the Flushingites wouldn't give the 3 housing, because very few were willing to take the risk of inviting them into their houses. So they slept in a nearby orchard field, probably somewhere near where I lived. So very few, nevertheless, there were crowds to hear Hodgson preach. And naturally, word got back to Stuyvesant, and he ordered the arrest. And this was done in the town of Hempstead, east of Flushing, by the local sheriff. You ready for this? Richard Gildersleeve. Does the name Gildersleeve sound familiar to you older folks? Okay. Since he read the charges to them in Dutch, Hodgson had no clue what was going on. And the great Gildersleeve, remember, kept him as a prisoner in chains in his home. One day, the sheriff went to evening services at the local church, and when he came home, he found Hodgson in chains, preaching to a crowd on his own front stoop. So Stye had him and the other 2 brought to the city for trial. He was thrown into a dungeon, and his companions were released. Stuyvesant liked to pick on one criminal at a time. Okay? So naturally, the trial was in Dutch. So again, Hodgson had no clue what was going on. And he refused to remove his hat. Big deal about the hat. And he was knocked off to preserve the dignity of the court. He refused to pay any fines, so he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor. This is a reason I'm telling the next part of it. He was taken outside and flogged with a rope 4 inches thick, dipped in pitch. The beating continued until he was held upright by 2 slaves until he went unconscious. While he was outside, he asked what he had done wrong. When Stye heard he had asked this question, he put him back in his cell for 2 days and 1 night without bread or water. Then he was stripped to his waist and hung from the ceiling with a log tied to his feet, and he was again beaten by the slaves. An Englishwoman was sent to hear his dying words and was horrified, and her husband offered to give Stuyvesant his largest ox in exchange for Hodgson, and Stuyvesant refused. Instead, Hodgson was back chained to a wheelbarrow. No one was allowed to help him, and he ordered the arrest of anyone who offered Hodgson lodging. I'm going into a great deal of detail about his treatment because of when it happened and what it caused. All this torture of Hodgson was in November 1657 and probably caused the gathering of the Flushing wasps to write the Remonstrance the next month on the 27th of December. Okay. Naturally, Stuyvesant didn't like the petition and had several of the group arrested and tortured, and the sheriff lost his job. So the law against the Quakers continued in place. Okay. So those are the key players. But now comes the last part of my history of the Remonstrance and the group that was fascinated me with their accomplishments. So you give me another 30 seconds to get this one lined up. Hope I brought it. There it is. So, Bound family. Why am I so interested in John Bound and his family of descendants? It only happened because when I was researching the Remonstrance and the references to John Bound and his house itself kept bringing up specific descendants of his and their outstanding accomplishments. So let's start with John Bound himself, 1627 to 1791. I don't have a picture of him, and neither does the Bound House Society. I already called them and asked them. He was an English immigrant who settled in New Netherlands, village of Vlissing, later Flushing in 1749, along with his father and sister. While his brother-in-law was one of the signers of the Remonstrance, John himself apparently had nothing to do with the writing of the protest. People still can't figure out how that happened. He became strongly connected to it, however, when he allowed some Quakers to use his house for worship. When word of these meetings got back to Manhattan, Peter Stuyvesant, Brown was arrested and tried for violating the prohibition against worship services other than Dutch Reformed. Like the Quakers, he refused to take off his hat, in front of Stuyvesant, and he refused to defend himself. It didn't matter since the proceedings were all in Dutch and he didn't understand what was going on anyway. So he spent several months in jail and was finally separated from his family and shipped off to England and then Holland. And when he was in Holland, he pled his case using the Remonstrance before the head office of the West India Company. Apparently, they were very impressed by his testimony. After a month or so, they sent him back to New Amsterdam, along with a message to Stuyvesant to allow the Quaker worship services. Funny thing happened. Stuyvesant didn't get a chance to disobey the order as Director General since the English took over New Netherlands the next year and he was out of a job. And so Mr. Bound became a local hero. His wife was the sister of a signer, was a Quaker who got him to allow her friends in the Bound House, and she converted him to the Quakers. And she herself became a very forceful speaker and a strong co-worker of the founder of the Quakers. And she founded a group called the Women's Meetings, it provided equality to the women equal to the men. And it was pretty radical at the time and for a long time afterward. So John became a strong Quaker himself and founded and built the Friends Meeting House on Northern Boulevard in Flushing. I've got a picture of it later. And it's still there and is the oldest such Quaker in the country. It was directly across the street from one of my closest friends as a kid, and we never paid any attention to it. It was just another big old building, okay? Apparently, he and his descendants prospered quite nicely, to say the least, as can be seen from some notes on a few descendants, starting with a guy named Robert Bound, 1744-1818. He's famous as the founder of Bound and Company, which is a stationery company, in 1775. Over 150 years, it was the foremost financial, I think I got a picture of him. Yeah. Foremost financial printer in the country. And it didn't hurt for the company to be in the center of finance, that is New York. Okay. and it was the oldest publicly traded company in the U.S., and it's still in existence, okay, as the famous South Street Seaport in Lower Manhattan. And Robert, along with some guy named Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and others, they were the founding directors of the Bank of New York in 1785. And it's still in existence. And it's now owned by the Mellon Bank. It's the oldest bank in the city. Again, along with Alexander Hamilton and a guy named Aaron Burr and John Day, he founded the New York Hospital in 1771 and became a long-term director. The hospital still exists as the New York Presbyterian Hospital. My father practiced medicine there 100 years ago, and all my siblings and I were born there. And he was also founding director of the Mutual Fire Insurance Company in 1787, and it was the first such company in the country. And with Alexander Hamilton again and John Jay and George Clinton, they were the founders of the New York Manumission Society. Anybody know what a Manumission Society was? It was about seeking the freedom of slaves, okay? And that organization also found the Africa Free School in 1787. And then this is important to the development of where we live today. In 1791, he formed the Inland Navigation Company, which led to the creation of the Erie Canal in 1825. By the way, one of his young employees went up and down the East Coast seeking for ways to expand the business into fur trading and real estate. When Bound refused his expansion suggestions, the young man quit and went on his own and did pretty well. He eventually owned a significant portion of Manhattan real estate. His name was John Jacob Astor. Well, the next one is Walter. We got it. He was the mayor of New York from 1829 to 1833, and he was a major supporter of and a co-founder of the formal Erie Canal project. There were three other members of the Bound family who became mayors. John Lawrence had a park named after him right near my house in 1673. Cornelius Van Wyck Lawrence, who served from 1834 to 1837, right after Walter. And this guy, Robert Van Wyck, who served from 1898 to 1901. I'm violating a law calling him this. This guy was a friend of both my great-grandfather and grandfather. And my father insisted that Van Wyck, which was eventually an expressway, was pronounced Van Wyck, not Van Wyck. We all totally ignored my father. Okay. So then comes Robert Bound Minturn. His mother was a descendant of John Bound, and he was founder of Grinnell Minturn, a famous and important shipping line known for its ownership. Okay, anybody know what that is? The famous clipper ship, the Flying Cloud, which held the speed record to and from New York and San Francisco for over 23 years. Well, he was also heavily involved in transporting poor Irish to the States during the Great Famine. Apparently, he did so not out of sympathy for the poor Irish, but to make a profit. In 1848, he and his family spent 18 months sailing around Europe and the Middle East, and he was inspired by the beauty and the amenities of the city they visited. When he came back, they wanted to beautify Manhattan to emulate what they saw in Europe. So they pushed for the creation of a great public space for the people of the city. And they bought some land and they donated the land that we now call Central Park. Okay. By the way, he and his family sailed around Europe in one of his ships called the Patrick Henry. And the captain of the ship was a man whose last name was Delano, the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay. So he was heavily engaged with his wife, also a Quaker, in fighting slavery and supporting the Underground Railway. And he helped create the American Geographical Society, the Children's Aid Society for improving conditions of the poor. He started the New York Life Insurance and Trust Company. And as I mentioned, he died in 1866. His wife, Anna Mary Wendell, died in 1886, worth $1 million. The New York Times said that in 2020 dollars, that was equivalent to 1.74 billion. They did okay. Okay. So there were a number of found women who were all very heavily involved in the abolition movement and in the training of free Africans. And there was the first school for free Africans was in Flushing, okay, starting in the 1700s. So they kept this. They financed an outfit called the Flushing Female Association, along with their sisters, and that stayed in existence until 1967. So I'm predating any public schools. Now the Bound House that you saw, you got the picture, okay, remained in the family from 1662 until 1947, when the last members of the family sold it to the Bound House Historical Society. It's believed to be the oldest house in America, housing the same family continuously for nearly 300 years, 285 years to be exact. So anyway, so I think I've got the list of the accomplishments of the family. Okay, you can see all the things that I mentioned in there. Take a look at the one at the bottom. And this is an outfit called famouskin.com. And I only found this a couple of weeks ago. And it basically says family relationship of John Bound, that he was fourth great grandfather to Abraham Lincoln. Not a bad accomplishment for a family. Right? I figured that they were not part of the wealthy Bounds in New York, that somewhere there was a strain that went off somewhere right, on the other side. So, in any case, that's enough for my rambling for one night. So I hope you've all had a good nap. Okay? That's it.
Yeah, Jeff. The one question that went through my mind as you talked about the law as implemented by the Dutch in that area that resulted in so many being punished basically for evoking some speech that counteracted countermanded the law. Was that, do you have a feel for how unusual was that at the time in the New World? Or was that pretty common?
It was very clear that Peter Stuyvesant was more severe than just about anybody around. In all the histories that I read, this was not uncommon for him to beat up somebody like Hodgson. That was his habit during the whole period that he was there. So some people say, well, the Dutch, were very tolerant, but apparently his boss, the company, West India Company, went along with him, and that this idea of the Netherlands being very tolerant was very, very questionable, and that they were getting immigrants that they wanted to have in Amsterdam. It helped their prosperity. The golden age of Holland was during the 1600s. But as far as the other ones, we know in England that we had some things where people got burned at the stake, in Salem and all of those places. So it wasn't uncommon to have some treatment, for people who didn't adhere to your particular religion. So, that's the best I can say about that. Now, my friend Howard Dooley said, if you ask me questions I can't answer, which could be pretty easy, his answer as a professor is, I'll get back to you on that.
I have a question about the relationship between the Remonstrance and the first article, First Amendment to the Constitution.
It's interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, if my math is right, the Remonstrance was published as an article of faith about 122 years.
130.
Yeah, because the 1789 is when the first 10 amendments came into play.
Ratified in 91, but anyway, yeah.
Are you suggesting that the Remonstrance played a role?
That's what the historians are saying, yes.
In the thinking of the people who amended the Constitution?
That's exactly what the historians that I've been reading on this thing said. Some of them go like this, okay? But others say it was a direct reference. I'm trying to figure out, well, did it get obscure? Well, guess what? Look at the people who wrote the First Amendment. And who were they working with? Robert Baum. So it's probably likely that he would have mentioned to those guys, hey, my grandfather had a document you guys ought to take a look at. That's mere speculation on my part. So,
because the person who really organized and tried to sell the first 10 articles was James Madison.
yeah.
And he collected the objections to the Constitution and sent 19 to the Senate.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I'm saying is that every bit of piece that I researched, they have these historians who say it was a precursor to the First Amendment. And I understand exactly what your argument is, but I'm just basically saying what these historians say.
And the second point would, for me, would be, as I listened to you and read as much as of the Remonstrance as I could, they were that document was only signed by 29 people. I think that's what you said at the beginning.
Yeah, 30 altogether. Yeah.
And they were very tolerant people that signed that document.
Extremely so, because they went for universal and they went for a group of outsiders.
Except those people running naked through the streets didn't get a very good review from those people. It seems to me that Quakers were outside of the thinking of those folks.
They were the Remonstrance was written specifically for the Quakers.
It's an anti-Quaker statement.
No, the Remonstrance was written specifically to benefit them. They wanted Stuyvesant to stop torturing the Quakers. That was the whole point of it.
Thank you.
I don't have so much a question, but a thought. It seems to me that the group that is protesting here is a group of outsiders objecting very strongly to a figure in authority.
That was one of the big things they said. They had the guts to go after him, and they paid for it.
For this guy that was being beaten and jailed and so forth, and they apparently felt that this authority figure had just gone beyond what is reasonable, and they could see themselves perhaps being the victims of this guy at some point down the road. And so I'm just thinking about where in American history more recently have we seen a group of outsiders, people who are really not members of the inner group, taking the side of a beleaguered group and creating their own protest movement. And what comes to mind, just offering this, is the beginning of the civil rights movement. People in the South who were and from the north who went down to the south in defense of way blacks were being lynched starting after World War II. Um, this is a group of outsiders that we were calling the government to task.
Yeah.
It fits with that talk I gave a couple of months ago.
Well, the WASPs were not considered that much outsiders. They were Calvinists, okay? And the Dutch were anxious to get them in there to populate New Amsterdam. And they were not having any problem. I don't know what churches they had. By the way, Flushing is an interesting thing. When I was there, obviously it was all Northern European, whatever, okay? First generation, third generation before. It's now the single most diverse, ethnically diverse portion of New York City. And every single possible religion you can think of has within almost a 10-block radius running from Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims to temples are in there. If you go down Main Street and Roosevelt Avenue, you can't read a sign. It's all in Chinese. And it's got the 5 of the best restaurants, Chinese restaurants in the city, or in that town now.
I'm interested in oddities of American history, and I'm also a Michigander, especially interested in automotive history. And I wonder if anyone has noticed the resemblance between that wonderful large collar around Henry Hudson's neck, the
Yeah.
resemblance between that and an air filter on cars.
Oh, by the way, this is the friend's house, okay, that was right across the street from my friend. It's the single oldest friends meeting house in the country, and it's still in existence. We're going. That was John Baum was responsible for that's existence. So he's got that, and he's got the John Baum house too. So they were a pretty doggone active family, that's for sure. And I even found out there's an actress right now who's a descendant. I think her name is Kyra Sedgwick. She went, yeah, yeah. She went, yeah, about, and she's a direct descendant of John Baum. Anyway, so thank you all again for your patience. Okay.